On today's show, we're going to talk about what I love to talk about, how to actually win, how to win in the NBA this season, mostly going to focus on the player prop side of it. We'll also touch on NBA DFS as well. Well, first, let me say this. Over the last 3 years, the 3 years that we've been doing the NBA prop stuff, Dink and the team have somehow posted 13.9% ROI or better each year. And that's on massive volume. We're talking about 1,100 to 1,300 plays over the course of the NBA season, winning around 190 units, assuming unit sizes of $100 bets roughly each year. I guess the easy question, Drew, is how, right? And I know that's a completely loaded question. So let me start here. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that just try to bet player props on their own, and they're like, oh my God, how are these guys winning so much? They're betting them on their own from their gut. They know the NBA. What mistakes, I guess, do you think people are making who are just firing off at player props without much of a baseline to go off of?
I think the most common mistake that people make, and I see this honestly in the projection space too. So it's not just people who don't have projections, but it's people who do have projections as well. It's just not adjusting for context enough of the situation. So they will look at the last 10 games and they'll say, well, this player's gone over this prop line in 8 of the last 10 games. This is a great bet. What happened in those 10 games? Who was it in or out on their team? Who were their opponents? Were their opponents specifically susceptible to this stat category that they're giving up? Did they have any foul trouble in those 10 games, or were they fully clean in those 10 games? Like, just not adjusting for context, I think, is the biggest challenge to trying to bet off feel. And I also think the biggest challenge to betting off of purely algorithmic betting as well is not being able to adjust for context and understanding stuff. And so I think that's the biggest thing about being able to add value in the NBA, is that there's so much context that needs adjustment from a day-to-day environment perspective, because there is so much change each day in the NBA with who's in and who's out.
I don't want to give away too much about what goes on behind the scenes on the projection side, but I get the feeling from a lot of people, they think that when they see our projections, this goes for both NFL and NBA, they think it was just like automatically spit out by a sophisticated model and algorithm, which we don't do anything. It just, math just runs and that's it. And I really try to push back on people for that in the NFL side, especially because we literally go in there every week. I mean, I was just sitting there arguing with the guys about what our Aldrich Estime carry share should be against Jaleel McLaughlin. I mean, this is pathetic stuff, but the model doesn't know that Aldrich Estime is probably going to play more than he has at any point all season in this game. We're recording this Thursday around 3 p.m. Eastern, by the way. The model doesn't know that. That is on us to figure out exactly what the inputs should be. So on the NBA side, I feel like it's even more so there, how much personal touch needs to go into the projections.
It's hard to quantify exactly how much, but I'll put it this way. We've tried at every level of the projection. So player baseline, minutes projection, fantasy point projection. We've tried to make it entirely algorithmic, and it's been worse every time. It's very difficult to have things be entirely algorithmic in the NBA because of the adjusting context that you need. And so, our approach, we have a big team, 10, 11 people that are working on an assortment of things, minutes, rates, props, team level baselines. And we're getting input from all these people kind of across the board in these areas. So it's a very heavy hand on the manual adjustment side of things. And I specifically, like, my role on our team is to adjust and check versus the prop market our player baselines on a daily basis and compare them basically. So like everything our algorithm spits out every day, we're checking every input that goes behind it every day before we make a bet. That's how we're able to generate the edge. The edge that we're able to create is based on the manual work that we put in.
Yeah, it's just so much. I can't even imagine, because like I get stressed on an NFL Sunday morning. We have like maybe 2 game time decisions. And that's once a week. Drew and these guys are every single day. I actually think I wouldn't make it. Honestly, I really think I wouldn't make it. I would just be like die of stress and anxiety with all these questionable guys every single day and constantly needing to have the manual touch on all of them. One of the manual things that I think people wonder about or ask about is matchup based stuff. So obviously we're like adjusting for this somewhat on the model based level in the NFL. Certain teams are more likely to create pass catching opportunities for running backs. Certain teams are slightly worse against slot receivers than wide receivers, etc. I think that stuff can get overblown in NFL, but I feel like you lean into that stuff a little bit in NBA where it's like, I don't think that this guy can play 30 minutes tonight because his opponent is too big of a lineup and he's too small or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, what do you think about matchup based manual touches in the NBA?
Yeah, I would say there's probably more than in the NFL specifically when it comes to like minutes and rotations and different things like that, because certain role players will be more emphasized in a matchup than they would in a different matchup. So from like a playing time perspective, I think that absolutely is part of the process for us. I think it is probably overvalued in terms of specific statistical categories that teams might be vulnerable to or things like that. I think a lot of those things can just get wrapped up in pace in total of the game. In terms of like this team gives up a lot of rebounds. Yeah, they play really fast. Sometimes there are outliers where teams are more vulnerable than others that our DVP models might take more time to adjust to. But I would say generally on the matchup side, it's more impactful on thinking through the minutes than it is necessarily thinking through the efficiency against the category. And the reason I say that is because generally in the NBA, much like the NFL, we'll say that teams are really bad at, allowing these types of things. But it's really like the really bad defenses are really bad at allowing everything, and the really good defenses are really good at like limiting most things. There's some nuance to this, like some teams' defensive schemes are set to allow more 3-pointers and different things like that. But generally, I would say that matchup on a statistical basis is a little bit overvalued. On a minutes projection basis is probably a little bit undervalued relative to the NFL.
All right, let's talk about some actual certain kinds of plays. So, like the most common plays that the public is on is stuff, all the stars and points, right? How many points will Steph Curry have tonight? How many points will Anthony Edwards have tonight, over or under? I feel like that's not a big part of our portfolio on the ETR props team. And I think, to most people, I think that should be obvious. There's going to be a bigger edge for us, our ability to project the seventh guy for the Raptors. I assume that the books aren't messing up Steph Curry's points line very often. So, it's harder, right? You need to know exactly how many minutes and exactly what the rates should be for the seventh guy on the Raptors. But I feel like you can create bigger edge there. And by the way, credit to the books, man. I don't want to like side with the books or anything like that. Putting up like the eighth man line for the Spurs, how many steals he'll get in the game. I mean, that's ballsy stuff, man. But it's out there every night. So, Dink, what do you think about all that stuff? Where should people be looking in terms of categories, kinds of players, etc.?
Yeah, so I would say definitely star players are a smaller percentage of our portfolio. I think it's more likely if we're going to bet a star player that we're more likely going to be on the underside than the overside, just generally. A lot of times when we are betting star players, it's in the situations where they've had kind of, contextually, they've had a strong run of late. That is maybe kind of, on the 80th, 90th percentile outcomes for them. And we see reasons that this could get back down to the 50th and the lines kind of moved up. And so we might take those situations, or situations where maybe the markets kind of push things up. Usually that's not the case as much in NBA. There's not as much kind of market movement just on, individual casual gamers kind of wagering. And then I would say points, though, generally is our most bet prop. So points itself is our most bet prop line. But as you said, it's more, we're usually working, I would say, like 4 through 8 on the roster is kind of where we're finding our sweet spots and understanding kind of the nuances of the matchup, the context that night, the situation that might allow them to outperform or underperform the book's expectations.
Yeah. Okay. The injury news is obviously the big story of the NBA. Dink alluded to it already with context around all these game logs. Like, these guys sit out constantly. I mean, it is actually, I think, a problem for the league. It's a total mess, but these guys are constantly sitting out and they're getting scratched late. I think people wonder, should they actually bet this stuff, right? Like, let's say you're on Twitter and you see that LeBron James was scratched. Obviously, Anthony Davis overs are going to start looking really good. I feel like that's a good way to get your account torched, though, Dink, like, betting injury stuff before the book moves the line, etc. What do you think about that, account longevity, anything else related to injuries and betting props?
Yeah, I mean, account longevity whenever you're betting props is going to be a challenge just naturally. Like you have to kind of mix in things that are other than props, and then the thinner you get on kind of the advantage play in terms of taking advantage of news or different things like that, specifically on player props, the more you're going to draw attention to yourself in terms of what you're doing. So I would certainly recommend that being a very small percentage of your portfolio of wagers if you're doing any at all. And if you are really concerned about account limiting, account size, and sizing of your bets, I probably just wouldn't even play around with it. What you could do on occasion is bet into sides and totals instead of betting into the player prop situation. So in the NBA, it's different than the NFL where there's only 5 players on the court for a team. So one player can be wildly impactful to the line. I mean, you can have players worth 6-7 points to the line in the NBA. That's not the case in the NFL. So you can almost kind of blindly bet on news, sometimes sides, and maybe that gets lost in the shuffle a little bit. Going straight to the player prop side of things, I would be careful on.
Yeah. And we're not betting those for the official
No.
releases. No immediate injury news. Reacting to injury news before the books can get it, etc. That's not part of the portfolio. But if you are in the Discord, I'm sure the guys in there are always talking about that kind of stuff. All right. I used to just go to the NFL props page. This was like 3 or 4 years ago. Fire off unders on pretty much every player, then have a printing press on our hands. The books have adjusted massively in the NFL to the point where now roughly half of our bets are overs, which makes me puke, but roughly half of our bets are overs, half are unders. In the NBA, it's always been different, right? Injury rates are so much lower. It's just a tighter band of projection that doesn't skew as hard to the under. Books, though, are certainly adjusting the NFL side. I'm curious what's going on in the NBA. What do you think about this whole lean of overs versus unders on the NBA side?
Yeah, so if we look at the 3 years that we've had the product, our ROI on unders in each of the last 2 years has gone down from the previous year before. So 3 years ago, we were at 19.7% ROI on unders, then 17.4%, now 15.9% last year. And our ROI on unders has been better than our ROI on overs historically. Part of that going down is the market sharpening. Part of that is also like our record keeping early on in our first year. Our threshold for an official bet was something that was, available on DraftKings, Caesars, or FanDuel. Like any of those was fine. And so now we're like, you need all of them. And so our pool of bets is a little bit narrower as a result. But part of that is also the lines sharpening. I would also say that like our win rate on overs in previous years wasn't as strong as last year. And I think that's some modeling stuff that we've gotten better, but also lines getting a little bit shaded more towards the under, that's opening up more opportunity for the overs. So I think it's a combination of things like our ROI on overs 3 years ago was 8.5%, then 8.0%, then 13.5% last year. And I think the majority of that jump is us improving our modeling. Like our data science team really looked into some situations that I think we were over projecting, and we figured out how to fix that leak essentially. And that drove the bulk of that. But I think some of that also is there's more opportunities being presented by lines being shaded a little bit lower.
Yeah. Okay. So for those guys who don't know the process of what happens here, if you are a props NBA props subscriber, you're in the Discord, you have access to all of our releases, and then at 5 p.m. Eastern each night, our full stat projections for that night come out. In other words, you'll be able to see exactly how many steals, blocks, everything, points, assists, rebounds, everything that we have for every single player. So people are always asking how to use this, right? I have all these full stats. The thing is, by that time, Dink and the team have already looked over and picked over and taken every single bet they thought was good. And so if something looks good, once full stat comes out, there's probably a reason Dink and team passed on it. And that's what I always tell people is like, be real careful with that stuff that's still out there after full stat is out, because I guarantee that our team already looked at it. However, Dink, I've seen some stuff from subs who have said, actually, I've been winning by just using full stat after 5 o'clock and finding my own stuff. So I'm not really sure where I come down on this. Any thoughts on full stat, how to use it, etc.?
Right. So I'll give a couple different examples of why we might not have released an official bet on it. And some of them are things that you should be betting if you see the opportunity, and some are ones that you shouldn't. So the first one that I'll give is the shouldn't category. Is we have a big projected deviation from the market on players, but there's a huge questionable tag looming in that situation. A lot of times nowadays, the books have just removed all lines when there's a big questionable tag. So there's nothing even to bet on news-wise. But sometimes they'll just shade the lines up because they know people want to bet overs. And so it will look like we have unders on players. But really, if you remove the questionable player from the situation, that line would be fair, essentially. Now, we've done all that work. We've done the checking for you that like, hey, is that line too pushed up? And then we've calculated like our percentage feel on how likely that player is to sit. And then we've made a decision, because sometimes we do bet into questionable lines that we think we have a lean on whether the player's available or not. But generally would not recommend the user trying to parse through that information on their own. Think it's really tricky. Think it's not the best use of resources. Then the second one that I'll say that I think you should be trying to take advantage of is if you see a situation where we're showing edge on a specific line, but that line does not have consensus around the market. And there's instances, as I just alluded to, where for our official record keeping, we've now made it that we need a FanDuel line because that has the most market liquidity on it, or we need DraftKings, Caesars, and then essentially offshore market confirmation of the same line. So there might be situations where there might be a really good line on Caesars or on DraftKings that is not the same line on FanDuel. There might be like 13.5 points on FanDuel and it's 12.5 on Caesars and DraftKings. And we would bet the 12.5, but we don't have market consensus to release the 12.5. That's a good bet if you can get money down on DraftKings or Caesars, right? So there are those situations that you should be looking for. There are also categories that we don't have enough liquidity to release. Like if we release it, it will just get taken down instantly, because a lot of these books, they have fail-safe set in where as a certain amount of money comes in, they just take down the line, right? And so for lower limit categories like steals, blocks, sometimes three-pointers made, there's just not enough liquidity for us to make those officials. We make very few of those officials during the course of the year. We have improved our modeling. They are the most varying categories, so you might get a wild ride on that. But we have improved our modeling on that front, and I would say those are areas and categories that you could probably target as well. So it's really trying to think through, why is the team not betting this or releasing this as an official play? Is it because they don't have the ability to, based on the rules and the guidelines that they've set for themselves, to try to keep this product as clean and as efficient as possible? Or is it because there's something that they don't know that they're waiting on? And sometimes it also might be a situation where, like, our vetting process for these bets is we want consensus from our team. So we want at least 3 people on the team to agree that, yes, this is a good bet. And there might be instances where a couple people are like, on feel, I just don't want this on our official record. And that might be a situation where you, the bettor, might want to bet that, but you might not know that we have like no lean on these things. And that's ultimately like the scenarios that you should be trying to sift through to bet. But the biggest thing I try to avoid is if there's questionable tags, and even if it's on like a 8th person in the rotation, it might be the thing that's actually holding us back from releasing a bet.
Absolutely. And yeah, just on that questionable stuff, I mean, obviously we're looking at all the contingent scenarios behind the scenes and seeing where the bets may or may not fall out there. I want to get to DFS stuff here, but I know this was on the sheet, Dink, but I realized we never talked about the Jontay Porter thing. And I'm curious what you thought about it. I talked a little bit about it on the solo, but I'm curious what you thought about it as someone who's in the streets here every day. For those guys who don't know, Jontay Porter was, I don't know, what was he, like the 8th or 9th man on the Raptors or something like that?
Yeah.
And basically he pulled himself out of games because he had bet, allegedly, he had bet, he said he was hurt, pulled himself out of games so he could hit some unders for some big SGP type stuff for some group. I don't know exactly how all that went down, but yeah, it obviously wasn't good for the NBA prop street in general. I guess I'm just curious your general take on what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what happened, I think it's unusual, but it was a player that was on like a 2-way contract that wasn't making NBA money, that was vulnerable to, to feeling like they could make some easy money this way. I would say not particularly savvy to the risks that they were enduring, because honestly, like, it's got to be the biggest red flag in the world for anyone at these sports books to be like, we're taking like 18 times the handle we've ever taken on any prop on Jontay Porter tonight. Like, that's got to be incredibly big red flag. So not the most sophisticated scam to try to angle shoot, but I think for the industry, I would say that generally it kind of goes hand in hand with the books that are offering the lines on like this deep down on the roster. They're, because it's so hard to price those efficiently, they're also really aggressive in limiting accounts. They're really aggressive in they're not taking a lot of money on this action just generally normally. Now, if they have this situation where they've got like what they think is a whale account, maybe they'll take a bunch. But I think because of that, it would be great if we didn't have lines on those types of players. Like, I think all we need is like the top 6 in the rotation really to have lines on, and that would be totally fine. And we'd still be able to run like a great props product on that. But these 8th, 9th, 10th guys, I think is like, something that we don't really need. And I think it's something that could be vulnerable to getting removed.
Yeah.
My concern was more that like the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, and like this is used as like an instance of like, hey, this is why there shouldn't be prop betting, when really prop betting is the whole thing that caught this.
Right.
Like the whole thing that caught this guy trying to influence games was the fact that we had a legal market. If this was not happening in a legal market, this would not be caught because there's an illegal bookmaker, on the Jersey Shore that's trying to go to the government and be like, hey, feds, I got taken for all this money. And they're like, hey, yeah, we'll lock you up too. So I think people were misguided in understanding like, these are the ills of sports gambling. And it's like, no, this is the legalization of sports gambling, catching the ills of sports gambling.
Right. Totally agree. And I also think that one idea that I had for the books was don't include the 7th, 8th, 9th guy in SGPs, right? Let's have them for straight bets. But there's no incentive for Jontay Porter to do this on a straight bet where he can get, I don't know, a few thousand at most or 10K at most. So SGP, he was going to win like $1 million or something. The group was going to win like $1 million. Do we really need Jontay Porter to be available in SGPs? And I feel like that would solve a lot by just having Jontay Porter stuff in straight bets instead of SGPs. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Free consulting there for all the books that I'm sure are listening very intently to this. Okay, let's go to DFS. So obviously, like the biggest question we get all the time, it's very different than NFL DFS from a strategy standpoint. How should people? I actually think we have an article about this somewhere. Should resurface that. But what are the biggest adjustments NFL DFS players need to make as they get set for NBA DFS season?
I mean, the biggest adjustment by far is just the time you have to make decisions. That's if I could say that you had one skill set that you could come into the NBA DFS streets with, if you can make decisions quickly or be prepared to make decisions based on alternate scenarios, I think you'll be able to be successful. If you really need a lot of time to think through your decisions, it's going to be chaotic and it's going to feel frantic and you're not going to enjoy the game because the NBA injury news, unlike the NFL gives you two plus hours to prepare, basically like an hour and a half to 2 hours to prepare for inactives. In the NBA, 30 minutes is like usually like the better case scenario. Sometimes you'll get information during the course of the day. Oftentimes you can get it right before, like 10 minutes before, and sometimes in the worst case scenarios you get it after, and that's the most frustrating. But in those instances, because in DFS, everything is relative to one another. When you remove a player, one of the 8, 9, 10 players that are playing for a team on a given night, it changes the distributions of the projections for everybody else on the team. Sometimes wildly, sometimes not that much. But being able to deal with that information quickly and make adjustments is like the most important thing by far in terms of transitioning from NFL DFS to NBA DFS.
Yeah, I also think the correlation stuff is a big adjustment, right? Because in the NFL, we talk so much about correlation and what kind of lineups work with each other. I feel like any kind of lineups can work in NBA. I know people are constantly talking about game stacking. I know you have an article about how and when to game stack. But yeah, how much do you think about correlation in NBA versus NFL?
I think the big thing you want to think about correlation, like NFL correlation applies kind of no matter how big the slate sizes are, but certainly the smaller the slate sizes, the more teams that are on bye, the Thanksgiving slates or whatever, like the smaller the games you have, the more likely it is that one game is just the game you really want to be in and you want to kind of over correlate. That happens with NBA too, but if you think about NBA during the course of the 7 days of the week, you might get a 2-game slate, a 6-game slate, a 12-game slate, a 7-game slate, and all of those different sizes are different games that you're playing entirely. So like a 4-game slate should be played differently than a 10-game slate, and so on and so forth. And so correlation, I think the general rule of thumb is you want to lean into more correlation, the smaller the slate size that it is. But in NBA, because the other thing about this is in NFL, the points are distributed by events, by big events. And when the big event happens, the long touchdown, 2 players are getting points for that. In NBA, there's no big events that are happening. It's iterative scoring. And sure, a player can pass to another player and they score, and one player gets an assist, another player gets a basket, but it's a very small percentage of their overall scoring. One play is not going to make enough of their overall scoring to change the outcome of their performance on day. So since it's iterative scoring, you really need to be thoughtful on the amount you're spending on one team, because otherwise they need overtime. They need more minutes to be able to kind of accrue the ceiling. Whereas in NFL, 2 players are getting all of those points that could be 30, 40, 50% of their points on one play. That doesn't happen in NBA. So the correlations are different. Like, you need to be a little bit more price sensitive and thoughtful on how you're correlating in the NBA than in the NFL.
Yeah. Or, I mean, the NFL, you can just play Baker Mayfield with 4 of his pass catchers and Bucks defense and win. You know what I mean? It's like there's no end in sight. Okay, like all these DFS games, things have certainly evolved in the NBA. It's certainly evolved a ton in NFL. Dink, how do you think NBA DFS has evolved over the years, and where do you think the edge is now for the best NBA DFS players?
I think the edge for the best NBA DFS players is more. So I think NBA DFS, much like a lot of DFS sports, has become more projection centric. So I think most people that are playing NBA DFS are pretty hardcore. There's not as many casual people, just like the toilet sitting bros, just making lineups right before lock. That's not happening in NBA nearly as much. So it's a really projections based sport, and I think the best edges in NBA DFS right now are understanding the fragility in projections and also where the projections can look at the end of the night. And now this is changing as slate sizes change, and DraftKings and FanDuel experiment with the games that they include on main slate and whatnot. But one of the big edges in NBA is trying to understand that most of your opponents, 90+% of your opponents, are just taking the projections that ended at 7 o'clock Eastern time, right when there's lock, and they're assuming those are the projections that they should play off of, and that's the end of it. The best players are trying to estimate what are those projections going to look like at 10 o'clock Eastern time or the last game. Like, what changes will happen via news, injury situations, whatnot, that I can be ahead of, because sometimes you'll get basically what looks like a bad play at 7 o'clock becomes a very good play at 10 o'clock. And because of that, nobody's on it. So imagine that you could play the best play on the slate at 7% ownership. That happens in NBA from time to time, simply because most of the field is not preparing in advance for news that could be in their favor. And so I think the best NBA DFS players from a tournament perspective right now are those that understand that risk reward dynamic and are able to lean in even when they get the news wrong, even lean in because, hey, the times I get it right are going to be so much more valuable to me than the times I get it wrong.
Yeah, we had a question related to that from Whirly Bird. He said, is NBA DFS pointless if you can't stay around your computer until 10:30 p.m. Eastern? Whirly Bird does note it's tough to be on the hashtag team if you do have to be at your computer until 10:30 p.m. Eastern. Is that a prerequisite, Drew? Do you have to sit there until 10:30 every night?
I think it depends on the slate. What FanDuel and DraftKings experimented with last year is there were days of the week that the main slate was only games that went to 8 o'clock Eastern time. So none of the 10, 10:30, 9 o'clock, 9:30 games, they weren't included on the main slate. It seemed to be like it was happening every Friday, but it wasn't communicated effectively from either company in terms of like what their intents were. I would love some more clear communications on that, because that would be helpful to the people that are playing the games as well. But I think if the games evolve into that, then no, then you just have to be around till 8. But you do need to be around for whatever the latest game is if you're going to play this game optimally. Because when news changes, it really moves the nature of the slate in a big way. And if you're not taking advantage of that and you're not using all of your edges to your advantage, you're probably leaking ROI to the field.
I am old enough to remember when FanDuel didn't have late swap at all for NBA DFS, and it was great. At 7 o'clock, whatever happened. If you got a late scratch late, you eat it like a man and you don't complain about it. The advent of this nonsense, I don't even know what's going on out there, people complaining when players get scratched late and they're saying void their bet or their leg of their stupid parlay or whatever. That has made it impossible for the sites to go to no late swap in NBA, because everybody just bitches too hard if one of their players gets scratched after lock. So yeah, that's just like that. It just is what it is. That's just why it is like that.
Yeah. I still have arson allegations out against Condia for a fire in a Mexico NBA game years ago where he had no players from, that I had 3 players and lost tens of thousands of dollars to him. But that's for another
Yes,
time.
exactly. Okay, let's get to some listener questions we got here from the people. First one from Justin Edwards. He says, which statistical prop, points, boards, etc., has been the most difficult to project, and why do you think that is? Dink, what statistical prop has been the most difficult to project, and why do you think that is?
So I would say things that happen the least frequently are probably the things that are the most difficult to project on a game by game basis. Over the course of the season, they're not as difficult to project, but on a game by game basis, you will feel kind of the ride of the roller coaster if you're betting steals, blocks, 3-pointers made, those things that only happen 1, 2, 3, 4 times a game for most players. Those are the ones that are probably the most difficult to project. If you're talking about more mainstream statistics, I think rebounding can be a little bit difficult to project. We've actually done pretty well in rebounding. We've had like a 19% ROI last year, 17% the year before. But what can sometimes happen on rebounding is you can get these like situations where a guy gets like 4 rebounds on one possession simply because he can't make a layup or a dunk. And it's like, that's a little fluky in terms of whether he just put the ball back the first time or whether he gets like 4 tips. And so sometimes that can be a little bit fluky. I think the more stable stuff is probably points, PRA, the combination of points, rebounds, assists. And then I think assists is fairly stable. There's some nuanced stuff that we do a good job of accounting for, but I think those are a little bit more stable.
Cuzzy says, would love to know either of your guys' thoughts about NBA cash games, as DraftKings has supported contest sizing less and less over the years. So you guys know I love to play NFL cash. I used to actually like to play NBA cash better because if someone isn't good, they don't even have to be not good. They can just be like off by a little bit and they are drawing real slim to beat you. Whereas the NFL, you can have a team that is clearly better than your opponent. I mean, 10 points better, 15 points better. And you can lose a ton. You can lose over the course of a year, even if you're getting it in good every single time, because the NFL is so wide outcome. NBA is much tighter outcome. If we have LeBron James for 40 points, he's not scoring 15 unless he gets hurt. You know what I mean? It's just not happening. Whereas in the NFL, obviously that can happen at any time. So I still think that if you can get the right kind of action, cash and NBA is a good idea for building bankroll, but I understand that there's less and less action there these days. Dink, what do you think about the state of NBA DFS cash?
Yeah, so I haven't played NBA DFS cash for a number of years. There's 2 things that go into that. One is when I was playing NBA DFS regularly in the season, I had to make a decision ultimately, like because of those quick decisions that you have to make, you can't do cash and tournaments well. I think it's like impossible to do cash and tournaments well. And so I had to make the decision between like the thing that I had a chance at like posting 20, 30% ROI if the year went right, to the thing that I'm posting like a 7% ROI, and like my attention just went in the direction of where there's bigger opportunity. I think that's the case for a lot of players. I think the other challenge about NBA cash is that NBA DFS is just not drawing as many casual people to it because of the requirements of trying to pay attention to the news and kind of be in line. And so as a result, those games, the sizing has come down. I think you're playing against like sharper people naturally. I think though, if you are finding games against people who are trying to do both tournaments and cash games really well, and you're just trying to do cash really well, I think you could probably grind out an edge. Yeah. The edges are going to be small. They're not going to be 10, 20% ROIs. They're going to be in probably the 5 to maybe on the ups, maybe in the best case scenario, 10 to 12% ROIs. But I think if your focus, like I think NBA, because it's a game of distraction with all the news and attention, if you are focused in one thing, I think you can be better than people who are trying to do all the things. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people who are playing DFS at a high level, they're trying to do all the things. They're trying to play FanDuel, they're trying to play DraftKings, they're trying to play cash, they're trying to play tournaments. And it's too much. It's too much to manage all the different things. So I think, specialty and narrow focus in NBA DFS can be rewarded.
Yeah, I love that. Brad says, I would love to hear Dink's approach to using variance for projections in NBA. How much is too much in a 150 set of lineups when NBA projections are much less volatile than NFL/MLB? So what Brad is referring to is the settings in your optimizer, the variance setting in your optimizer. Obviously, if you are interested in using optimizer for NBA this year, our partner, the one that we run, is the Solver. You can check that out on the subscribe tab on establishthерun.com for more details there. Just if you do sign up, please use the same email that you are using for ETR so that all of our data, projections, ownership, everything ports over seamlessly to the Solver. But anyways, Dink, what do you think about this question? How much variance should people be putting on the projections in NBA if they're running a 150 set?
Yeah, so I use less than I use in NFL. In terms of like a standard number, I don't have one, because what I like to do is I like to test to try to manage my exposures. Now, it gets nutty when news is flying, which is why for me now the NBA DFS that I play is almost entirely playoffs or like Christmas Day slate where things are spread out and I have time to react, because I'm managing all our props and our projections and everything. It's just too much for me to try to play NBA DFS tournaments at a really high level while doing that without sacrificing the product for the customer. So when I'm playing those slates that are more static in terms of the news, NBA playoffs, there's usually like maybe one injury you're waiting for that day. I can run a number of times through the optimizer to try to manage my exposures and get where I get. And so that number that I use is lower than what I use in the NFL, but it varies based on what I'm trying to accomplish on that given slate. I would say in the NBA streets, I'm generally in a range on the variance side of occasionally zero. I wouldn't say, long-term all the time zero, but occasionally zero, to as high as like 30%. I'm probably not going too much beyond that. In NFL, my range is probably more like 20 to like 60, where I'm going and what I'm using. So I think because of the projection accuracy and the stability and the iterative scoring nature of NBA, I don't think you need as much variance. But the specific number that you use, I would highly encourage people to, instead of getting hung up on a specific number, really trying to test different numbers to see how the portfolio exposures look, because some nights you might be more confident in the plays that are grading out as really well than other nights. And you want to have that reflected. You don't want to just use the same number every single night.
Some people may not even know what we're talking about. I probably should have set this up better. Like if we have LeBron James for 30 points and you put on 30% volatility, what happens to the projections?
Yeah, so his projection, so 30%, the easier way to do this would be like 10%, right? 10% of 30 is 3, but 30% is 9. We can do that math too. So it would take a number between 21 and 39, and for each single lineup, it will choose a number randomly between that input, and it's doing that for the entire player set that you're running variance on, and then it's making a lineup that's optimized based off of the number that it chose for each of those different individual players.
Yep. Okay. Fatboy FF says, do you think it's realistic to be a profitable NBA prop bettor without access to good projections? So this is kind of what I was getting at the top. If you're just raw dogging it, as the kids say, I just found that out that's a term now for not using any type of like data information. If you're raw dogging it, do you think it's realistic to be a profitable NBA prop bettor?
Realistic? No. I think there are people that probably can do that. I think they're outliers. I think if you were to try to do it under that circumstance, I would recommend narrowing your focus down to like a specific stat or a specific team or something. Like if you're trying to spray the board off feel, I'd be really hesitant to try that approach. And I'd be really hesitant to buy into long-term success with that approach. If you are narrowing your focus to like, I'm going to learn the Brooklyn Nets, and I'm going to learn the Brooklyn Nets so well that I don't need projections, that I like have a good idea of like what they do in these situations, maybe is the answer. I'd still doubt it, but maybe. But if you're just spraying the board and like wide focus, I don't think so.
Well, and I think a lot of people fall into the trap if they're going off their gut, where it's just, what have I seen lately, right? And it's really hard to get our head around how fluky some of this stuff is, like Derrick Henry looks like he's going to score 40 touchdowns right now. I mean, if you ask me in my head and my gut, it's like, yes, Derrick Henry's going to score 30 touchdowns. From a projection standpoint, obviously, I know Derrick Henry's not going to score 30 touchdowns. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe he will score. Maybe he will score 30 touchdowns. But like, yeah, if you're not doing this stuff with a baseline, and that's why I always encourage people, like, there has to be a mix of both. You need like a baseline. I probably IKB stuff more than people want me to, but I also have the baseline. I understand like what's going on. I feel like you need the baseline of the projections. And honestly, like if you're going to bet props, I feel like you need the best projections, like something that's like 10% off of the best.
Yeah.
And I consider us to have the best. And like, if you're like 10% off, that would scare me for betting props because, like Dink said, if a line is 13.5 or 12.5, that's going to make a big difference. Just like if a projection is 13.2 or 12.6, that's going to make a huge difference also. So yeah, it's just got to have the best, I think.
Yeah, if you're
Go
in
ahead.
the example, if you're like 10% off, like honestly, like we're talking about things that would swing bets in one direction where like the 10% off on the projection would go from being a good over to being a good under. Like
Right.
it's just it's a totally different. So I agree with you that the level of accuracy and precision, that's why trust me, we've tried to make it purely algorithmic. We could run a better business if it could be purely algorithmic because we wouldn't have to pay everybody, right? We wouldn't
Right.
need all these humans, but it's very difficult to do really, really well. And a lot of the edge that we've had is on the manual side of the projections, and that's why we invest so heavily in our team, and we continue to build and grow our team. This year will be the biggest team we've ever had working on this stuff.
Right. Yeah. It's different than NFL where people tell me, oh, I have my own projection system, but they work on it's one person, but they work on it all
Yeah.
week. And there's not that much like news that changes late. For NBA, I don't know how you could do it unless you have like multiple people on 24/7 to be looking at this stuff and manually tweaking beyond the algorithm. Okay, last question from Young Simba. He says, can you please just go over how the Telegram will work for receiving props? New to it, how does this work? So I don't want to get too into the weeds in this at all. If you're interested, there's an FAQ on the site. You can certainly check it out. But basically, the bottom line is that this flows through Telegram and Discord. You'll get a warning in Telegram. Then you go to the Discord and you find it there. You have once the play goes out in Discord, you'll have anywhere from, I don't know what you think, Dink, 5 to 30 seconds before the line is moves. And yeah, it will move certainly that fast for multiple reasons. I mean, the biggest one being books know that we win. And the second one is that they're getting a ton of action on something that they were not expecting to get a ton of action on.
Yeah, the only other notice that I'd have there is people ask like, why don't you just warn in Discord? The Discord warnings like are a little bit inconsistent with when they go out. Like if you have Discord open on your computer at home, your mobile Discord notification will be like way off. So that's why we notify in Telegram, and then it's basically a notification like, hey, a bet is coming. There's no other details. It's just a bet is coming. We've experimented with different release processes. People will ask us, hey, can you give more information in the release? We're like, I understand you want more information to get queued up. That bet is going down instantly. The more information we give, the less time it stays up. We've tried all these different methods. We're trying to do the thing that the most people can get the bet. That's the thing that we do. So it's bet incoming on Telegram. You log into Discord, you go to our ETR NBA bets channel, and then a bet will populate there, somewhere between 30 seconds to 2 minutes after the bet incoming notification.
Yeah. And then the other part is, of course, like I mentioned, 5 p.m. Eastern every day, full stat comes out if you have a props sub, and you can go hunting yourself on there. Just be sure to listen back to what Dink said about potential pitfalls for shopping yourself on full stat. It's certainly a dangerous game to play. All right. Anything else you want to mention here, Dink, before you go off to war for the next 6 months? Are you still doing ETM? The people need to know, are you still doing ETM for the established million for the rest of the season?
I am, with the exception of one wedding weekend that I will be stepping out. The ETM episode that is 1019, I will not be able to be there for.
Oh, I'll be on. I'll be
wedding.
There.
Yeah,
yes,
but every other ETM I'm still signed up for. My process for ETM is literally consuming everything I can Friday night from 10 p.m. Eastern time when the last NBA game locks till about 2:30 a.m. Eastern time, and then I go sleep for a few hours, and then I get up and I do a show on ETM. I have not consumed like any football content until that point because my head is just in the NBA streets.
Okay. Anything else on the NBA stuff before we get out of here? Anything we
I would just say, I think we covered it all largely. I would say that if you are interested in looking at the props product as a subscription that you think works for you, please do read that FAQ. It's very important to us. We make it a weekly subscription because we know how hard it can be to get these bets. And we don't want to have you have to have a long-term commitment to us. Like you can try us for a week. If it doesn't work, you're gone. You don't have to have a monthly commitment, a season-long commitment. Like we know how hard this space can be to get bets and whatnot. But we've been able to run a service because enough people are getting the bets. That they're willing to pay for the bet. So that's why we're able to do it. And just, in general, just like I'm just a representative of our team. Like I am one of 11 people that are working on this, and all of them do incredible work. And I'm the face of this because I'm the leader of the team and whatnot. But Mike Gallagher, Sam Jeffarinia, Chris Leet, Ryan Schwepfinger, like all these guys on our team, a bunch of new guys that we added on the team, some that are professional prop bettors themselves. Like we're really excited about the team we have, and we are ready to go this season. So I'm super pumped for NBA.
Oh, I feel the same way, man. I mean, people give me way too much credit. Everybody behind the scenes at ETR NFL does way, 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 way more than me and are way sharper. Okay. That's going to do it for this NBA preview. Hope you guys got out of it. If you're got something out of it, if you're into or plan to be into NBA props or NBA DFS, if you're interested in our plans on the NBA side for this season, you can go to the NBA tab on establishedrun.com and the subscribe tab. You'll find everything there. For Dink, for producer Luke, for producer Ryan, for everyone behind the scenes at ETR NBA, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.